In my experience, HR is the stakeholder, and they can be either an advocate or a roadblock for motivational job design. I know very few HR organizations that have any capability in that space. If I were an enlightened HR leader, I would seize on that because managers don't get any training in this. Being able to sit across the table from a manager and say, let's talk about how your organization should be set up, what the humans in your organization need, I think that'd be a fantastic value proposition for HR, which, by the way, is going to make the whole recruiting and talent acquisition part so much easier, rather than a manager copying and pasting a job description and say, go fetch me one of those.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. As an expert in architecting businesses, Thomas Bertels has spent the last 2 decades helping companies struggling with a recurring problem, employee disengagement and its result, which is inefficient teams and low productivity. From smaller family companies to big players like PepsiCo, Thomas realized these issues always stemmed from the same thing, the poor design of work. That's when he decided to build a practice around motivational work design that's employee-centric, optimizes teams, reduces operating costs, improves output, and more. Thomas Bertels has been redesigning operating models and business strategies across the world for over 25 years. He's the founder of PurposeWorks consulting firm, working with big pharma, leading insurance organizations, and Fortune 50 companies like Johnson Johnson and Pepsi, among others. In this episode, we discuss why so many operating models are poorly designed, especially as it relates to creating productive teams, how to design meaningful work environments to meet and exceed company goals, restructuring procedures to increase production and improve the customer experience, creating well-constructed jobs that encourage employee autonomy, breaking down large organizations into smaller entrepreneurial structures, taking advantage of employee differences to improve workflow, how to create effective feedback channels, and more. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoy this episode, please remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now I bring you Thomas Bertels. Welcome, Thomas, to Work for Humans.
Thank you, Dart, for having me.
I'm super excited to have you on the show. And a part of the reason is that you and I share more in common professionally, even though we've only spoken a few times. We've worked in the same disciplines. We've worked in business architecture, which very few people have really worked in. We've worked in large operational change management. We've worked in transforming operating models for Fortune 50 companies. And so the first time we spoke, we could just drop right into very dense conversations because we share a vocabulary. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about the experience of work. I won't always do this perfectly, but I'm going to be a CEO. And I'm going to talk to you about transforming my company to become more of an employee-centric company. And we'll see how that goes. I want to start off with the idea that as a CEO, I'm worried that my best people are leaving. And they've told me it's because that their experience of work is not good enough. You do something called motivational work design, which I've actually never heard of described that way, and I love it as a term. What is motivational work design?
Yeah, so the basic idea behind motivational work design is that you can really only do a good job if there's a good job to be done, right? Which begs the question, what makes a good job? And that's been researched, I think, for, 50, 60 years at this point in time, going back to Douglas McGregor. I think probably the last big update was by Daniel Pink in his book Drive. But basically, a lot of this research keeps finding the same thing over and over again, right? People want to do meaningful work. They want to have autonomy, and they want to know how they're doing. So a well-designed, motivating job delivers, right, what people want. It provides meaningful work, meaning people can do a task from start to finish. They can use a variety of different advanced skills. And they know that the work that they're doing is important for somebody else. So they understand the purpose behind it. And beyond that, they can decide, right, when and how they do the work. And they get feedback just by doing the work itself. So if you have a job that meets those requirements, that's a well-designed, intrinsically motivating job. Now, the problem is that oftentimes when we design work, we really don't think about those components, right? We think about the tasks that got to get done. Typically, you have a challenge right in front of us that, a client wants a report, and then we'll hand it to somebody. And so over time, right, people's jobs evolve into these stacks of tasks without really ever stopping and thinking, is this a well-constructed job? Will doing these tasks, doing this work, be intrinsically rewarding and motivating for you? Or is it going to be just an endless array of meaningless, mundane tasks that you don't consider as particularly meaningful? So that's the underlying idea behind motivational work design.
Okay, so there's two angles I want to explore there. One of them is I've read a lot of that literature, and my experience is that it has a high-level understanding of what people want, which is those high-level concepts. But when you drill into those, you find out that the specifics from person to person are quite different. So it seems like there's a real challenge to create a custom, meaningful work design for different people. How do you cope with that deep variation?
Yeah, I think, one of the variables to look at is like how important, right, professional development growth is for you. And there are some folks, right, that just want a job because they need to pay the bills. And they have another second job that's much more important to them. All right. Think about like a jazz musician. Jazz musicians don't get paid. Most of them don't get paid a lot of money. So you need a job that goes from 8 to 5 that you can do in your sleep so you can conserve all your mental energy for rehearsal or for being on the stage. So not everybody has this desire to have a really challenging, intrinsically motivating job. And so you get a little bit the round peg square hole problem, right? You want to make sure that you put the right people into the right roles. Because if you put somebody who wants to have, just an 8 to 5 job that they can do in their sleep, you put them into a very demanding job, they're going to get incredibly frustrated and drained. The flip side is also true, right? If you take a very motivated, driven person and you put them into a job that is not particularly motivating or engaging, right? That's like the fastest way you can think of to drive people out the door and look for other opportunities.
How do you create a system that knows what people want? And is that a part of the work design service that you deliver?
It's part of that. The basic idea is that behind our offering is that, where you can actually start by understanding how people experience their work today, right? And what they see as a deficit. Because let's say you do that diagnostic, we call it the Mojo diagnostic for motivational job design. And you find that everybody is very happy with the job. And I think this is perfect, right? It gives them meaning, it gives them autonomy and so forth. Then you don't have a problem. If you find, on the other hand, that people really experience these jobs as not particularly rewarding and meaningful, then it gives you an opportunity to change that. And again, in that context, then you can reconfigure that and hopefully come up with a better work design. And those better work designs, quite frankly, are oftentimes also more effective. So instead of like breaking work down into small bits and bobs, right, you oftentimes try to put it back together and have somebody to do an entire job from start to finish.
Can you describe a story, maintaining confidentiality, of the process from when you walk in the door to do motivational design through delivery?
Absolutely. Full disclosure, right? I come out of the process improvement operations space, right? So the way that oftentimes these engagements start is the client says, we're having issues. I take this example of an insurance company. We have these issues of onboarding clients. It takes too long. We have countless problems as we go through that process. We have a turnover and an engagement issue with the people who do the work. Can you take a look at this? So you start to map that out and you try to understand how does the work get done today. And you find out that there's 19 people involved in the process and there's handles back and forth. It takes forever to do it. And the left hand doesn't know what the right hand does. And then if you overlay that with the employee experience, you also find that the people who do the work don't experience this work as particularly meaningful. So you take those two parts together. You have an ineffective, cumbersome process and you have a bad employee experience. And then, you can invite people into the process and say, here's how the work currently gets done. Here's how you experience it. How can we make this better? And the answer is pretty straightforward oftentimes, right? You put individual tasks together into like a complete job that hopefully somebody can do from start to finish. And to the extent possible, maybe you can have one person do the entire process, right? If that's not possible because you need different skill sets, maybe you can have a team be responsible for it. And then you can take that further, right? So as you now, right, look at what kind of skills we need. Maybe you don't need 19 people. Maybe you just need 5. And maybe they all sit together and bring the different disciplines together so they all educate each other about their respective domains. And then you take that one step further and you say, well, okay, we have a team of 5 people that can do the whole work from start to finish. How about we connect them directly to the customer? So instead of creating layers and layers of separation, open up the feedback channels. So you're just going to work for all the customers in the Northeast region, let's say. And you own those customer relationships and those experiences. So you can be accountable for that. And you have all the functions that need to get done inside your team. So there's really nobody else you're dependent on. And so as you go through those steps, right, that is both a good process design. People in the operation excellence world would call it a lean cell or a lean pod. But it's also a very effective work design because now everybody can see what's going on. They can see the whole job from start to finish. You don't need reports to tell people what the backlog is. As a matter of fact, you actually need a lot less supervisors to tell people what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and check whether they've done it because it becomes blatantly obvious. So it also creates like a flatter, more scalable organization.
Wow. That overlaps with so many conversations I've had recently. It sounds a lot like some of the conversation I had with Gary Hamel, who wrote Humanocracy. And his point was you build an organization into smaller teams, you give them lots of exposure to the customer, and you give them a lot of autonomy. What I particularly like about that design you just said is it solves for a couple of things. First of all, I've noticed people need a detect on the completion of their work. And I'm going to use an example here of my pen, which is that when I put the cap on, it goes click. And that's the detect that says that I've succeeded on the action. And what this small team has is a very direct view into the response of the customer and can see when they've made a difference. The second thing I like about it, first of all, a lot of people, when you ask them, say they like to work with teams. And so it gives a team structure to execution and people are less alone. So it's got a very human surface to it. I actually think that's a key to what you just said. It's got a human contact to a customer and it's got a human contact to the other members of the team.
Yeah, the other, I think, benefit that it has is because we're not all alike, right? So you take 2 teams, right? Every team is staffed with the same roles, right? You have a benefits administrator, you have an enrollment person, whatever it is. But they're all slightly different. And if you work in a team, those differences don't become a problem because the team can compensate for it. You're going to find somebody who says, oh, it's like you struggle with that. I can take that on for you. Or they can fill in for each other's roles. And that becomes very difficult in a traditional, very functionally driven organization model where everybody got to fit the exact same mold. It's like the idea of how car manufacturing evolved, right? It was initially like a bunch of craftsmen that would build these things from scratch. And so if the tolerances on one part weren't quite exactly right, they could fix it by, making a dent into another part. And so what Ford brought to bear was everything is standardized. So all these parts are exactly alike. And I think that's very powerful if you talk about industrial production. But I think if you talk about people, we don't all come alike. And so you got to have a design that takes advantage of those variations.
Yeah. A part of what that is that a small team like that can be more adaptive. The system's way to say that is that it can express more of variation in response to the variation of its environment. So it can be very adaptive to the needs of the local area.
Yeah, and I mean, but there's also plenty of research that says, effective team size is 7, right? And we're still a little bit in this hunter-gatherer mode, right, where we can, I think, effectively communicate in small groups without a lot of formality. Once you get to very large, complex organizations, then you need very clearly developed coordination mechanisms to make sure that the work flows. So I think these small teams, I think what Gary Hamel talks about, I'm 100% a believer in. You can break larger organizations into smaller entrepreneurial structures. I think that's very powerful. I started my career at a company called ABB, Azea Brown Boveri. When I joined, it was 400,000 people, but they were organized into 5,000 companies. So some of those were substantial, right? You're building turbines. You can't do that with 25 people. But some of them are very small. There was a group of 18 people based in Zurich that was doing financing for power plants. And that was its own legal entity. It was its own CEO, CFO, head of HR. And so that made it, I think, a very flexible and interesting structure for people.
Yeah, one of the challenges I see with the way a lot of the companies are organized, I call it the dungeon entrance, which is that when you join them as an individual contributor, you get put into this little cell somewhere deep in the organization, and you know your inputs and you know your outputs, but you don't know why. And all you really can hear is the people that are downstream from you complaining about what you've handed them. And you might turn around and complain to the people upstream from you about what they're handing you, but you don't know what's going on. And you don't really know how to get better. And so I like this model a lot. So here I am now, I'm a CEO, and I realize that I could be delivering better designed work. How big a change is that to my business model or my operating model? I guess the first question is, how would you know, and what would you do about it?
Well, the answer to how big of a change it would be, right, depends a little bit where you come from. Let's say you're a CEO of an insurance company where structures, I think, have been pretty fossilized for the last 30, 40 years. That's probably a big lift if you want to push it to the extreme. But in many instances, you don't need to, or you may not even want to push it to the extreme. So there's this notion, for example, that I think everybody needs to be in a self-directed team. I think is a fallacy. I think in some jobs, you really don't want that. I think you need more control over the work. Right? You're changing fuel rods in a nuclear power station. You don't want people to improvise that. So I think that there's definitely some limits from that perspective. So I think it depends on the business need. It depends on how predictable your environment is. Like, what's the right setup for you? And it depends on where you start from, right? If you have like a history, right, a very top-down culture, senior leaders make all decisions, right? People can buy a pencil without like getting an approval. That's going to be a heavy lift, right, to create meaningful work with autonomy and so forth. If you're already halfway there and you have, for example, right, some agile team structures in place and so forth, but you just haven't gotten around to the routine work that needs to happen in the organization to make that more rewarding and interesting, I think it's an easier lift. I think culture has a big part in this. So if your leadership has a servant leader mindset, I think it becomes a lot easier. Because at the end of the day, this work needs to be substantially owned by the people who do the work. Right? Nobody washes a rental car. Right? So if right, you don't give me the autonomy to decide right what the work looks like, why would I care about it? Why would I even refine it as conditions change? So a servant leadership mindset is definitely a little bit of prerequisite, I think, to get this done. Because if you as a leader think that I know best and I can decide this, then I think you should go into a conference room and map that out. And stick in this mode that, you create this design, you try to roll this out, like you try it for a year, then you go back to the drawing board because, again, it doesn't work. But I think a more enlightened leadership would probably agree that in today's knowledge-centric organizations, the people on top know only a small fraction of the issues that happen at the bottom. So why don't we create conditions for the folks at the bottom to take ownership for it and drive it and hold them accountable for it? But you got to create the design space.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That the ability to know what's going on close to the ground, close to the customer in a larger company, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, everything gets boiled down to like a bullet point. It was a 50-page report that from the field, right? By the time it gets to the CEO, it's like a bullet point on the slide.
Right. Or from a data perspective, each individual customer is having a different experience that's unique to them, but we're going to boil it up into an average that doesn't show the variation in that experience, and it'll look fine at an average level or just a little off.
Plus, it gets filtered on the way up, right? Because, again, like as these numbers come up, people are very protective. Nobody wants to be embarrassed. I had a friend of mine call it like the watermelon phenomena, right? Everything is green on the outside, but once you cut inside, it's all red.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to explore an idea here, which I have not at all formulated, so here we go. I was just talking to Fred Reichheld. He is the person who came up with the Net Promoter Score and who framed the importance of developing customer loyalty. And one of the things he pointed out is that in order for customers to be loyal, employees need to actually love the customers. And it's a really interesting thing that he's gone through, which is that he's essentially articulated the emotional state that each player in a business needs to strive to achieve. And so one of those is that employees have real empathy for the customer. And I think that empathy for that customer requires the closest contact possible, which is that doesn't roll up into a number at the executive level. And so if you want to build empathy into how you run your business, these small teams close to the customer might be the right way to go.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although I think most organizations really struggle to be really customer-centric. And then partially the work design is to blame. Because ultimately, empathy is nice, but if you can't solve my problem that I have as a customer, if you're not empowered to do so, right? If you got to hand it over to 19 other people that might process it somewhere in the back room, that's not going to generate a high net promoter score. So I think if you think about your last experiences with any customer service function, right? When you reach out with a problem that you have, like how many times can people actually resolve that? When you call them, are empowered to resolve that, are able to fix the mistake that was done. I'm still chasing Lufthansa for a lost car seat, right? And after numerous phone calls, I got told that the policy is after 100 days, I could probably get compensated for that. So I think you have a lot of these structures that really prevent people from doing a good job. And I think Gary Hamel had a couple of great examples in his book about Southwest Airlines that I think give the frontline employees the ability to make things right for the customer. And I think even beyond empathy I think is a starting point, but you also got to be able to do something about it. And I think, again, that's maybe where work design can help. At the very least, to have a counterpart for the customer that is equipped to deal with a broad range of issues and has some degree of autonomy to do something.
Yeah. I have to tell a quick customer experience story since I'm living it right now, which is that yesterday my LinkedIn account disappeared. This is very alarming. So I reached out to LinkedIn. The only way I could do that was to create another LinkedIn account and buy premium, because you can't reach customer support unless you're a premium customer. But my premium account was gone, so I had to invent a new one. So I reached out to them and I gave them all the information they needed to know to find my account and resurrect it. And they responded with a form letter saying, hey, tell us all the information we need to know to resurrect your account. Well, that's because that customer support person is being measured on their first touch cycle time. And as a result, it wasn't about resolving the problem. It was just about getting back to me in time. When you do this work experience design, where's HR in the mix? Are they at the table, or is this something that is out of their scope?
Well, I know that you work in HR, right? So I got to be a little careful here. But no, in my experience, HR is the stakeholder, and they can be either an advocate or a roadblock, really depending on, I think, how evolved I think the HR function is. I think the reality is that this is actually a space where HR should shine, but they oftentimes don't. And I think they really have ceded the space of work design or given up completely on that. I know very few HR organizations that have any capability in that space, not even job design, just talk about organization design and provide some useful advice for leaders. So there is oftentimes not much capability. But I think it is a space that, if I were an enlightened HR leader, I would seize on that, because managers don't get any training in this. They just struggle through the day by day. So I think being able to sit across the table from a manager and say, let's talk about how your organization should be set up. And let's not just talk about the efficiency, but also what the humans in your organization need and what's the profile of the people you have and how can we make this work for you. I think that'd be a fantastic value proposition for HR, which, by the way, is going to make the whole recruiting and talent acquisition part so much easier, rather than a manager copying and pasting a job description and say, go fetch me one of those.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how HR has ended up in that situation. And by the way, you can't hurt my feelings about HR. I spend half of my days critiquing how HR runs. Let's actually talk about the role of the manager in this, because the role of the manager changes. How does the role of the manager change when work is designed this way?
Well, I mean, one I already alluded to, right? It becomes, you've really got to play the servant leadership role, that your job is to create space for others. I think that's one piece that changes. The other one is you got to get comfortable with having indirect control instead of direct control. The third piece, it requires, I think, a little bit more intentionality in terms of how the work is being structured, what work you acquire for your team. Again, if you think about certain the managers being, let's say, the CEO of this little enterprise, they have certain work products that they deliver. And, now you have two customer segments. You have the external customer you serve, and right, you have the employees to whom you want to provide great, intrinsically motivating jobs. I think that adds another layer of complexity to the task that I think people historically are not really well equipped to deal with.
Yeah, that's very aligned with my philosophy. It's very aligned with the idea that managers are in a broker role and that they need to both know what the business needs, know what their team needs, and act as the intermediary to win the kind of work that the team really wants to do where possible, and then allocate it inside the team or let the team allocate it themselves in such a way that it's going to align to their greatest passions. And so what I hear about this is that there's some fundamental capabilities that need to change. First of all, the team itself needs to know how to self-organize and needs to think of itself as a business. Are there other skills that the team itself needs to know in addition to their regular job when they start to behave this way?
I think you gotta realize that as a team, you're gonna go on a journey of learning, because odds are that jobs, we're gonna make jobs broader, right? So people gotta be willing to learn what's left and right. And oftentimes you get a little bit into status play, right? Where you say, well, I as a director only do certain tasks and I need an analyst to do all the legwork. But part of the idea is behind job design is to really overcome this excessive fragmentation. So oftentimes that really means, it might be beneath you, but if you hand it over 5 times back and forth, it really destroys, I think, the integrity of the workflow in the process, right? So it really makes more sense for you to do the whole job, including what you might find a little bit beneath you. So then you go into those discussions. But in my experience, once you align people towards, here's what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to get new customers onto the system in record time flawlessly. And so that becomes a team effort. People do all sorts of things for the benefit of the team. You see that in sports and many other human activities, right? We're not as self-centered, I think, as most people want us to believe we are. We try to do things for a greater good. Just look at the oodles of people and the amount of time and energy they spent into supporting nonprofits or working in nonprofits. The power of purpose, I think, is vastly underrated.
When we talk about purpose, how big does it have to be? And here's why I'm asking the question, which is that there's the purpose of the company, and there's the purpose of the team, and then there's my purpose on the team. The purpose of the company can be fairly distant and abstract, but the purpose of my job this hour can be quite specific. And so what's the right level of purpose? Where does it reside?
I think it got to be very close to where you might sit as a person, right? It got to be something that's meaningful to you. Take the example of golf. People play golf. I hear it's one of these sports where you get eternally frustrated and don't get much better. But people do it anyway for the sake of getting better, right? Or any kind of sport. And I think that's the same. I think you got to provide people the opportunity to get better and better at their job, to perform at a higher level. That, I think, is probably more important, let's say, than the larger purpose of the enterprise. Now, in some cases, those two are very strong. I do a lot of work in pharma, and a lot of people there in that industry I know are motivated and by the ability to tackle some of the toughest diseases that we have in the world. Find a cure for some orphan disease where nothing exists. I think that can be very motivating. But if your own job is incredibly fragmented and yes, it overall has a purpose, but I, for myself, can't really see what I'm doing, how that fits into the larger scheme, I think the larger purpose is not going to do much for you, but it's going to be more like a brand association. Maybe it makes you feel good and gives you a sense of worth. But I think ultimately, it got to be in your own lived experience that you're saying, this work for me is meaningful. And then, if I do that as part of a team and we all, are aligned towards that common outcome, I think that also has a lot of value.
I see that as one of the most common breakdowns in the model around purpose, which is that there's a desire to say what the purpose of the company is once, because it's just an efficient way to do things, and say we're all aligned behind that purpose. But then it's a little too abstract. And being able to bring it down to the one-on-one takes more work for somebody. And in fact, it may be one of the things that the manager does for the team is to establish the local purpose, a little more proximate purpose. So I'm imagining a company that is pretty far away from this model. How would you articulate the change effort? I know that one of the things that you do is you provide change management services. How would you go after understanding that? And maybe you already know what some of the changes are that really need to happen.
The journey is interesting because I think it would be false to think that it's all going to get driven at the bottom. And there's right, all the people that do the heavy lifting, right, do all the redesign work. And it's like the leadership just takes a long walk and comes back and nods when it's all done. So you need the strategic direction. You need leadership to set a clear path for the future. But again, the question is, to what degree does the leadership need to color all the boxes? And the answer is probably less than they think they need to. So you got to set the guardrails. You got to say, here's where we're going as a business, right? Here's how we're going to win in the marketplace. And then you got to, like in an agile model where the product owner says, this is what you're going to build. They don't get to say how people or the team is going to do it. The same model applies here, right? As you cascade it down, you got to say, and you guys figure out how we best organize ourselves to deliver against that. And then you can provide some principles where you can say, okay, right, one of the design principles is we want to make sure that to the extent possible, the jobs that we create are good jobs, meaningful work, autonomy, feedback. Great. The second thing is obviously around efficiency and effectiveness, right? So it's got to be something that delivers value for the customer and does it in a way that is somewhat productive and efficient. You equip the teams with the tools and some basic frameworks and you let them loose. And they oftentimes come back with it's like a functional work design that you then got to put through the pressure cooker and say, that's great that you as a team of 12 came up with this, but we got to scale that to an organization of 1,000. And there's plenty of other ideas around this. So let's open this up and let's get other people to critique this design and offer their ideas and use that as a way to make it a better design. And that process creates ownership at the bottom because now we all had a hand in it. It wasn't just like Thomas who helped us do this or the CEO who defined how the work gets done, right? We all had a stake on it. And so that I think creates the ownership that you need to make it something that survives the changes that are going to happen. And all throughout, you got to keep management engaged in the right way. As supporters, as cheerleaders, providers of resources, yes, as challengers, right? They also know the business, but it has to be channeled effectively. And, then you got to solve all the other problems that you got to solve. There's already 50 other things going on in the organization. The technology doesn't support this way of working. Oftentimes, technology is a laggard, right? We're stuck in systems that determine certain roles and certain ways of working. And oftentimes, right, we use humans as the middleware to connect where we don't have interfaces, right? So I think those issues need to be addressed. And people got to realize you're not going to solve this overnight. This is going to be a journey that you go on, right? So start in a part of the organization, demonstrate the value, and scale from there. Pretty much a common sense approach, quite frankly. I wouldn't bet the farm and say, let's start by everything, take everything apart and try to put it back together at the same time as we're trying to satisfy customers.
Another question, what's the role of finance in this transformation? What do they have to do?
That's an excellent question. They don't have a huge role, quite frankly. At the end of the day, right, this is a relatively low-cost initiative, unless you really fundamentally retool the technology. What you oftentimes find is as you do that, if you push it to a certain degree, you realize you end up with a flatter organization, right? But to work through those issues, that typically becomes more like an HR topic. Right now, we don't need all these oodles and oodles of supervisors, but these are people that have really deep expertise in the business. What kind of roles can we create for them that help us in this transformation? And that oftentimes becomes a teaching role in that sense, right? So really providing people with the skills. But that's obviously a big change, right? Whereas people in the past got their sense of value from, I have 12 people reporting to me. Now you might have nobody reporting to you, but you're really an advisor to a bunch of teams. That's not an easy transition. On the finance side, there's not that much. What oftentimes needs to happen, though, is that you kind of like rewire the reporting and all the metrics that you collect to make sure that you measure things that are more directed towards outcomes rather than activities.
One of the things that I can imagine happening is that you might have to rearrange your P&L structure so that sub-teams in some cases have their own ability to track their own revenue generation. I mean, it depends on how the teams are broken up. But in some cases, I would think that might be a real change of your cost center structure, for instance, or your revenue center structure.
It can go that far to the extent that you want the teams to be able to run their own P&L. But then you also run into this issue of internal service level agreements and transfer pricing and where do we keep the margin. And then oftentimes the finance people have an idea that actually should be an island where the taxes are low, right, and so forth, right? So that gets a little tricky, right? I think at the end of the day, you can make things too complicated for the teams too. I think in my experience, it's oftentimes better to say you have a clear customer, that's your accountability, you have a clear scope in terms of the work that you're responsible for. You sort out the rest, but don't make your life so complicated that you spend 20% of your time arguing about the transfer price from one part of the company to another.
I like that. And part of the reason I like it is that instead of centering on the financial aspect of it, you center on the customer aspect of it. And you trust that if you really are delighting that customer, you're going to satisfy the financial aspect.
Yeah.
It's a better thing to anchor on. And I'll tell you, on that manager switch, that the hardest kind of change that I've ever had to roll out was the kind of change where you had to change people's identity. And this change from, in the most extreme case, from command and control management to service management is an identity change. And I felt it. I inverted my own organization and I flipped the org model and I became a support function as opposed to a control function. But I know that people want to go up in their career and servant management makes you go down in your career. So it's a different feeling.
I'm just going through this right now. I'm doing a project, right? And so one pattern I found over the years, somewhat related to your question, is that you managers are totally comfortable creating teams and say, you go solve this problem. And then 3 months later, the team comes and presents their ideas to the big guy. And in some unfortunate instances, right, that big guy says, well, have you thought about X? And X is a really good idea. But now you added 5% of value and you sucked 90% of the energy out of the room because the team feels like, gee, how could we have missed that? So one thing I've started to do is to say, leaders, they oftentimes grew up in the business, have done these jobs, maybe a long time ago, right? But they definitely have opinions. They see a lot of things. Let's talk to them. They have a valuable, important perspective to provide, but it should be at the beginning of the process. And then at the end, it has to be supportive and enabling versus sitting in judgment. But giving up this role and this right of last refusal, I think that's a big mindset shift to say, I provide my input first and I'm comfortable and I trust the team that they're not going to use it as the gospel, but they're also not going to completely ignore it. And they're going to come back with a reasoned response as like, why or why not? That makes sense. And I think that's the big change and requires a big leap of faith. So it goes back to McGregor's theory X and theory Y. Do you think that people are lazy, stupid, and you gotta, better keep an eye on them, right? Otherwise they walk off with the furniture. Or do you think that, by and large, they want to do a great job and your job is to create the conditions? And yes, things are going to go wrong occasionally, but, like one bad apple doesn't spoil the whole batch.
Yeah. It's interesting. That's essentially what my management role has evolved into, which is that I'm there when we draft the statement of work to make sure that it's not going to get us into trouble by being overbroad, that it's focused. And I'm there at the close of the project to see how it went. And sometimes I'll do toll gates along the way. Usually other people do those, but sometimes I'll do toll gates. And my job there is to essentially a trainer. So to be there to say, there's a slightly higher shelf that you could have put this on at this step. Do you think we could get there? And so just raising the level. I'll just tell you another thing, which is that I just drafted my letter to my management saying I'm going to become an individual contributor because I think my role is obsolete. I talked about this in the conversation with Gary Hamel that I was like, I'm not sure what my job is anymore. Well, I think I can no longer be a manager. I think I can be an individual contributor.
Congratulations. I think that is really taking what you believe in and making it personal. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. And it feels great, actually. It feels really, really good. What's the gotcha in all of this? Again, I'm back to my CEOs thinking about making this kind of transformation. What are the landmines I should watch out for? And then my second question is, at the end of the day, what's the benefit I'm going to get?
I think the landmines are that it is a fundamental shift in mindset that it ultimately is going to get you to, right? Because you turn the organization upside down. So instead of like father knows best will tell you what to do, it trickles all the way down. It becomes a slightly different place where people take ownership of their work and say, hey, here's what we're working on. Here's what we want to do. Here's the resources we need. Help us make this work within the guardrails. And I think that's a big shift in how the organization is run. And so there are going to be a lot of managers that are very comfortable in the old model that I tell you what to do and I'll check right whether you did it. And they're not going to like that. It's going to be very difficult for them to retool themselves. Once you get to a certain stage in life, you're not going to become a completely different person overnight. So I think that's going to be difficult for people. I think the second fundamental landmine is the control piece. To get comfortable with this notion of indirect control. And I think that's enormous. And it makes a lot of sense. I remember talked to somebody from Columbia, Professor Passmore, and he says, think about the job of the senior executives, right? You got all these stakeholders, not just in the organization that all want something, right? But also shareholders, regulators, and so forth. And so there's a big incentive to avoid things rather than achieve things, right? So you typically could get fired for things that blow up versus things that maybe were not as quite as good as they should be, but it worked. That's, I think, one of the big issues. You really need a senior level cheerleader that says, I get it, and we're going to go down this path. And it's going to be uncomfortable, and not everything is going to go well. I believe it's a fundamentally different model. And, there's these guys, corporate rebels in the Netherlands that I think chronicled, right? And Gary Hamel too, right? Chronicled a lot of the companies where leaders have made that leap, whether that's, Southwest Airlines or Patagonia or whatever it is. And it is a little bit that leap of faith. And then I think in general, it just seems so much easier to most executives to just buy a piece of technology, right? I mean, all these investments in systems and ERP and CRM and CX and so forth, right? For some reason, we seem to have plenty of money for that, although very few of those systems ever can really show a clear return on investment, right? And we're messing with business process all the time. But when it comes to the people process technology, the people side of the box, we're kind of coming up blank because we know that, once we're talking about the job that people do and the role they play and we start changing that feels like we're touching the third rail. We hired them for a specific job. You're a data analyst. We said, this is the job we're going to hire you for. If we start to muck around with that, are you going to have different expectations around what you're going to get paid? Are you going to have anxiety around I'm trained as a data scientist. I don't want to do all these other things. So that becomes we got to deal with the messy humanoids, right? It's just not as abstract and rational, as detached as some of these other decisions that we can make. And I think that's fundamentally scary for people. Those are some of the landmines. To not navigate through that well and with humility and authenticity.
I like how you say humanoids. One thing about humans is that they essentially have to transform themselves. You can put them into a position to transform themselves and you can help them to be successful, but you cannot make it so. And so it's the very beginning, it's the very kernel of losing control and getting into more of an orchestration model is that first step. And then what am I going to get as a CEO when I do this?
Well, you're going to get a triple win, which is both incredibly rare. It's like the four-leaf clover, but you get much higher employee engagement because if you have a well-designed, intrinsically motivating job, people don't leave these jobs. They don't go from something where, I do something from start to finish. I have autonomy. I know why I'm doing this. I know how I'm doing, to like a traditional functional organization where, every step you got to get right signed off by your manager. They don't. They stay in those jobs. Turnover drops too. It becomes a non-issue. It can become a problem because people don't want to leave, right? Sometimes you want a little bit more fresh blood. So that's number one. The second thing is you get a lot more productivity because you eliminate all that white space in the organization as you move people closer together and you put the jobs back together. It's like, as I come out of the process side of things, right? In a typical business process, let's say an HR onboarding process, how many people are involved? 30. How long does it take to do the whole thing? A month. How much would it take if one person does this thing from start to finish? About like 2 hours, give or take. So you see that the wasted time and the complexity sits in all these handoffs. Right? You got to coordinate 30 people to execute flawlessly, right? For the employee to show up with laptop and access and so forth. But we have been trained to think that that's an efficient way to do it, and we'll offshore the work halfway around the world. It's a little bit counterintuitive to put it back together and say maybe fewer people sitting close together, right? That can be more effective. So you get dramatically improved productivity. You oftentimes also get lower cost if you really drive the autonomy down, because then you don't need all these layers and layers of supervisors. And the last thing you get is an improved customer experience, because you created line of sight, you created people that have accountability to the customer, you gave them autonomy to deal with the customer's problem. What's there not to like?
It's so funny because when you brought it down to onboarding, I saw it in a way I'd never seen it before, which is one of the things you're taking out of the system is wait time. So one of the things about lots and lots of handoffs is you've got lots of wait time and batching in the handoffs. And so one of the things you get with this model where there's sort of full life cycle support is you eliminate all the wait time between handoffs.
Yeah. And the need to manage all that work, because now you have queues, right? So Dart has 30 candidates in the pipeline. Thomas has 25. You got to move some over from Dart to Thomas to make sure that everybody has the same, right? So now we need spreadsheets to coordinate all of this. And we need service level agreements, and they need to be measured. And, has the talent acquisition specialist scheduled the interview as soon as he should have? You make it very difficult to change the process because these 30 people are now in 7 different organizations, and the reporting lines for those organizations, right, at the very top of the organization. And so, right, if somebody doesn't want to play ball along the way or right, not be very collaborative, you kind of hit a roadblock, right? So the security people, yes, wouldn't it be nice if there's like print the badges ahead of time that we have those ready to go? But they say, no, we're going to require, right? We're going to wait until that person shows up, and then we'll take the picture and the photograph and make sure it's really the right person. Well, it's a wonderful functional sentiment of like, this is important for you as a function, but it destroys the end-to-end process. We pay, I think, a much steeper price for this functional optimization than we oftentimes realize in terms of responsiveness, in terms of the cycle time, right, you alluded to. And I think the coordination cost, I think, is sometimes ridiculous.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier that I've lost my LinkedIn account and that I'm working through customer support to get it back. Well, the frontline support person is probably just a router, probably just routing me to the right resource to actually solve my problem. But I'm waiting 2 days to get routed. I have 14 days till my LinkedIn account is gone forever, and I lose my complete professional history. I'm a little bit uptight about that. Or onboarding is a good example, which is that if I could have a person who I knew was going to take me through the entire cycle and actually saw me as not a ticket, but as a person who they were escorting, it would be way better.
I had this conversation with a client of mine as we were looking to start the onboarding process. And starting point was to say, well, if you hire a senior executive, they don't go through the regular process, right? You're not just going to bombard them with like emails from 9 different people to fill out 9 different forms that have 90% the same information. No, right? We're going to have a senior executive level assistant guide them all the way through the process up to their first day, right? They're going to have a laptop. The office is going to be clean. It's going to be, right? The Nespresso machine is going to be on the table. They have a good experience. Can we scale that and make that available for everybody so that everybody has that seamless, wonderful experience? And the reality is, yes, we can. I mean, technology can help us, right? But oftentimes it really boils down to getting the humans that are involved in that process close enough together and close enough to the customer and equipped with the right tools to do a great job. And then people are going to do a great job.
Yeah, and what a great job it would be to onboard new employees all the way through, because those are happy people. And the only thing that makes them unhappy is waiting in a queue. But other than that, it's happy people who are joining the company and you show them how it's done. I love that idea. Just love it. So I ask this question at the end of every interview, which is, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
I mean, I have the best job in the world, right? Because I love to solve problems. I love to learn. I find it absolutely fascinating how businesses make money, right? All the different ways that companies can make money and be successful. I love talking to interesting people. So, I kind of have a dream job, right? And at the end of the day, if I'm successful, I make work better for people. They're going to have a better job, a more interesting, satisfying job. So those are all the things that I, hired my job that I self-constructed to deliver for me. And for the most part, it does.
What's your favorite kind of problem to solve?
My favorite problem is one of complexity, where you take a whole convoluted ball of wax and you start to peel it apart and you can boil it down to simplicity at the center of it.
I know that journey. That's the journey I go on all the time in my job, which is that you start off with something that's too big to comprehend. Is it about boiling it down to some first principles that can help you to find order in that complexity?
It is first principles. I think it's sometimes just common sense and so being able to take in all the complexity, but then getting far away from it to kind of like see what truly matters and take the noise out. The best example I can find is I was working with a client. It was also actually a hiring process. And they had this very complicated process for trying to optimize the ad spend for advertising these positions. Right. And so you're trying to fill 5 jobs, but they're in like 20 locations. So you have 100 different requisitions. So you get these daily reports that says 4 people applied here and 6 people looked at the ad here and 9 people interviewed here. But you got all these targets you're trying to meet. And so just imagine like every day you get this like humongous spreadsheet that gives you all this data. And then the tendency obviously is to say, oh, no, it's like this is underperforming over here. Let's move some money over here. The equivalent is kind of like day trading, right? That you look at the stock market and you have a portfolio of 100 stocks. And so you're trying to constantly like move money from here to there, buy low, sell high. And they were spending a lot of time doing this. And the problem was that it was kind of like 3 degrees removed from where the actual change in advertising spend happened. So by the time that they got the new reports, it was like a week later, and nobody would even remember what they decided a week ago. It kept a whole group of people busy to move the money from left to right and trying to optimize this. And so we looked at this and we said, well, we see 2 options here. One is you're doing a fantastic job. How you're optimizing this adds a lot of value. We should extract the rules that you implicitly apply and turn that into code. And right, that could be a wonderful product that we could maybe even sell to other people. Or we could stop looking at every day and just make every 3 weeks a decision to move the resources from left to right. But putting the potatoes out every day to see if they're grown might not make a lot of sense, especially if we don't have a reference point to compare it against. I love those moments where, I think you can just take something that sort of on the surface makes sense, but once you dig underneath as to like what actually happens, it's just activity that's disconnected from anything. It's like in New York City, right? 70% of the elevator door close buttons are not connected to anything. It's just the illusion of control, right? People push them, nothing happens, but I did something, right? So the opposite of the detect effect you were talking about earlier. And I find it deeply rewarding to find these things and replace them with something that just is simpler, is easier, takes all the noise out of the system, and it allows people to really focus on the mission.
Are you in a position to pick and choose or optimize the kind of work that comes across your table so that it matches these attributes of interesting, fascinating problems, interesting people, and making things better for individuals?
For the most part, I do, right? I mean, one is I just feel very privileged. I have some great clients and, many of them I've worked with repeatedly over many years. So they check all these boxes, and there's like a a mutual self-selection process going on there. They like what I contribute. I like working with them. We keep doing this, and they take me along their journey. And I find that very rewarding because then I see it's like how their role changes over time. You not just see a snapshot, you actually see the entire movie. And I really cherish that. And then quite frankly, right, there are people, if you're not looking to really improve the work, partially for the sake of the people doing it, so you're really 100% driven by optimizing ROI or minimizing cost and so forth, they tend to also work with other consultants and not with myself. So there's, again, this self-selection that's going on. But yeah, sometimes you're busier and you get a chance to choose what you pursue, right? Sometimes you're not as busy. And then, you also take on work that maybe doesn't meet all these criteria perfectly. But at least for the last two years or a year and a half since I put up my shingle, I've been in the former categories, which has been good.
And I've started thinking about a distinction between what we pay to get our jobs and what it costs us. And so what we pay is the value that we deliver to get the job. And we've talked a lot about the value that you deliver to buy this work. What does it cost you?
That's a great question. I think on the one side, I would imagine it's safety, because I'm an entrepreneur. There's no guarantee where the next client comes from. In consulting, you're always 3 months away from starvation, sometimes 6, sometimes 2. So that's something that, right, it's just the price you pay, that uncertainty that you have to deal with. I think the second price you probably pay is that you got to realize you have to work through the client. You have no direct authority to actually make those changes. And that can be frustrating, right, at times, because you're like, sometimes very clear to me what should be done, but it's not very clear to the client. And so being patient there and realizing that they might not want to do all the things that I think they should be doing sometimes takes a lot of patience and humility. Sometimes I fall short on that, but so that's another price I think you pay, that you don't have that direct ability to really implement things.
The part about uncertainty, I once interviewed somebody and I asked him, what job do you hire your job to do for you? And he had a very odd question that I've never heard again, which was, I hire my job to eat only what I kill. And here's what he meant. And it was a part of his identity. He liked the thrill of knowing that he had to win his paycheck every day. He actually liked the thrill of that. And so he'd built it into not a cost of that kind of work, but a feature.
It's smart to look at it that way, for sure. But the reality is, right, that you're just going to go through these ups and downs. And, the ups are great, right? That's the kill, right? And so those wins are very energizing, but they're also very fleeting. And you got to be able to deal with the downside. And I've been in this business for 25 years. And I have to say, in the last year, it's gotten better. For the first 24 years, you just feel the responsibility, right? Because you never know where the next project's going to come from and the next paycheck in that sense, right?
Well, and the responsibility to your team, which is if you're not continuing to win the work, your team's out of work.
The nice thing about it is that very quickly whether you have something that has value or not, right? Because if the phone stops ringing or people don't respond to your emails, then right, it's time to reinvent yourself, right? And find something else that you can do that adds value. If I look back at my career, I probably had like 2 or 3 of those, right, cycles where you realize, okay, people don't want to do Six Sigma training anymore. They're done with this. It's time to see how you can apply your skills in a somewhat related but more advanced field, right? And that part I actually enjoy. It's like the discovery, kind of like what's next, and starting to shape that.
Yeah, shaping your product line or your service line. I recently interviewed Stacy Barton, who is an immersive experience design expert who works for Disney and other places. And she used to work street theater. And she said the great thing about street theater is that when you're not engaging people because they walk away. They haven't bought a ticket. They're not sitting down. And she said it hones your craft and it teaches you what people will stick for. And I think that that's a thing that you have too, which is that opportunity to see what's the current value proposition.
I think that's part of, what makes the job so interesting, that, right, you have that direct feedback and you can react and respond to that, which from a work design, job design perspective is ideal, right? I do something, I get immediate feedback. So, for example, one thing I realized early on is, as I got involved in this topic, is that pushing it just under the banner of it's going to be great for the employees and it's going to give them purpose is true but useless. Because I think senior leadership needs a better rationale to buy that as a service. And so, but you realize that, right? Because people say they nod their head, but there's nothing that comes afterwards. And you realize you're not explaining this concept right? And so the ability to really convey that message more effectively and be able to refine and hone that every single time, I think is really nice.
Do you think that my positioning of saying that all businesses are multi-sided and that it's a multi-sided business model, do you think that that's compelling? Part of the reason I like to use it is that it puts it into a business language that can recognize another customer, and that there are lots of business models that have already done that.
I think it's definitely going to appeal to a certain type of leaders that look at this through an economic lens, and that helps them come to grips with it and find a space for the employees in their model. So I think it definitely helps. I think there's also plenty of leaders that probably, don't look at it through the marketplace lens. I mean, I like, for example, what Kevin Wheeler said, where he says, maybe we should look at employees as investors, and they invest their skills. They want a return, and if they don't get a return, both financially and emotional, then they're going to take their money and invest that elsewhere and take their skills and move elsewhere. And I think that's also, an interesting lens that executives can relate to. And I could imagine that some people definitely gravitate towards the product-centric view. They'll say, oh, yeah, that's right. Work is a product. I need customers. I got to design a better product. Some people, I think, I look at it through the investor lens, and other people are just going to realize that age-old thing, right? People want to work with other people to do important things. Maybe we don't need to overthink it beyond that. Because it's kind of true, even, right, senior leaders, right? Nobody wins by themselves. We all win as part of a group, an organization, a team. And that feels mighty good to win. And so people want that. So I think it's a team sport. That's what some people can connect with.
Kevin Wheeler and I have stayed up late arguing that point before over drinks, investor or customer. I have always won that argument as far as I can.
I feel like he might disagree, but maybe I'm wrong.
He does disagree. He absolutely disagrees, but he's mistaken. Thank you very much for coming on today. It was very, very interesting conversation for me, and I learned some key ideas that I think I can take right back to work and employ. How can people learn more about you, your work?
Well, the easiest is to go to our website, www.purpose.works with an S. We also have this diagnostic tool that facilitates our work design approach called the Mojo Diagnostic. And people can try that out and see how well designed their job is to be intrinsically motivating. And so a slimmed down version of that tool is available at mymojo.works, MOJO.works. Yeah, I think those are two good vehicles. If it was 2023, I would say there's a book forthcoming to learn more about work design, but we're not quite there yet. So TBD.
Well, we'll have you back on when it's time to promote the book. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dart.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.